Hello, movie nerds, and welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we're going to talk about Nosferatu. Before I jump into it, though, I did want to say I don't think, just as a note, that I will be putting out my favorite films and TV shows of 2024, like I have done in previous years. There are a couple of other films that I want to sort of talk about and do reviews on. So I think I'm just going to continue with some standard reviews up to the end of the year and then just keep trucking in 2025 as far as the podcast and stuff goes. So without further ado, we are going to get into the review, or my review, of Nosferatu. So for anyone who is not familiar with Nosferatu, the film was originally made in Germany in 1922. This version is Robert Eggers' remake of that original film. And for anyone who is not familiar with the original 1922 film, we almost did not get to see that film. I don't think that there were plans at the time for that film to make it to the United States, and they had been told before production that they should not be making this film, and they went ahead with it anyway, the production company that was involved in making that first film, because of the fact that Nosferatu is basically a copycat of Dracula. For anyone who has seen both or knows, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Nosferatu is basically a copycat. They changed some of the names and a few of the details are different, but it is very closely, almost, one-to-one of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And when they went ahead in Germany and produced this film anyway, Bram Stoker's widow actually sued them and won. And the film was banned. It was ruled by the court that all of the copies of the film needed to be destroyed. And instead of doing that, one of those copies, or a few of those copies, actually made their way to the United States. And I believe the first premiere of Nosferatu in the United States wasn't until 1929. And then, of course, it took foothold. It was deemed one of the best horror films of the time. And it has definitely had a hold on the American public ever since. And so this is a film that Robert Eggers saw when he was a child, and then it just stuck with him, and he knew that this was something that he wanted to make. He's been trying to make this film for a number of years. I believe Anya Taylor-Joy was signed on to potentially do this at one point, and for whatever reason that just didn't work out. I do think that we have a good lineup here. There was no one in the film, at least from my perspective, that I would say, oh, that person didn't do well, or that was a miscasting. I think he did a really good job in terms of casting for this film. As far as the movie itself, I will sort of preface this by saying I am not sure after seeing Nosferatu that I am really a Robert Eggers fan. I have seen most of his films, some of his films. I was not a very big fan of The Northman. In fact, I really did not like that one. I enjoyed The Witch, but I didn't, think that it was the most amazing thing ever. I thought it was good, like a good film, but I certainly didn't love it on the level that some people have really loved The Witch. And I feel like Nosferatu is not really that much different for me than some of his other films. There were parts of this movie that I really, really loved and really, really thought were incredible. And then there were parts of this movie that I didn't necessarily like so much, or that I didn't think worked quite as well in terms of how movies are that I super enjoy, right? And so I have to really just kind of, I don't know, for me, I think this one probably is a 3 or a 3.5 stars for me out of 5 in terms of just what I enjoy. I think if you are a Robert Eggers fan, you are not going to have any issues sitting down and watching this film and loving this film. I think if you are on the fence about Robert Eggers, or you're not really a huge fan of his, you enjoy his films, but they're not necessarily ones that you like seek out or super love, then I think that Nosferatu is probably going to be the same. If you really love like the original version of this movie, it's going to kind of depend. I really, really love Bram Stoker and his version, obviously, of that classic, like his story. And I do really love Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. That one has to be my favorite sort of adaptation of the novel. And so Nosferatu for me has always just been kind of something that I loved in addition, that I sort of knew was like the cheaper, if I can say it that way, like the cheaper knockoff of Bram Stoker, if you will, because the characters are essentially exactly the same. Instead of having, Count Dracula, you have Count Orlok. Instead of Jonathan Harker, you have Thomas. And instead of some of the other characters, Mina Harker is obviously Ellen in this film, at least. So that there is a one-to-one comparison between Bram Stoker's Dracula and Nosferatu. This film, Robert Eggers' version of it, I have to say, is incredibly stunning. There is absolutely no one. It would not surprise me if this ended up winning awards for just cinematography alone and how the film actually looks. It is very gorgeous. The costuming, I was most blown away, I think, by the costuming of this film. I think it is incredibly stunning, a lot of the things that they have done with this. And I do like the creature creation, if that's what you would call it, of Count Orlok in this film, or Bill Skarsgård's character. And on sort of that note, I think that Bill Skarsgård, I don't know what it is about him. I feel like when he plays in films and he is, like himself, if that makes sense, like he is a character in a film, I enjoy him. Like I obviously recognize that there is a good actor there. But when he gets into these roles, when he does some of these characters, like when he did the remake of It, and then certainly when he is Count Orlok in Nosferatu, it's like he just transforms into a completely different person. Like you could tell that it was him, if that makes sense, but he does not sound like himself at all. Like the voice that he does in the film is incredible, and it's so creepy. And it, like, at least in my theater, it is like a smaller sort of theater, and I'm sure that they are not spending a ton of money keeping the place up, we'll say that. And during certain parts when he is speaking, the speakers would like reverberate and like vibrate and make a lot of noise. He did a phenomenal job in this film. I absolutely cannot question that in any way, shape, or form. And I think the acting in this also was really good. I think that there were only just a few moments in this. Obviously, this film is meant to be quite dramatic. It is going back to that sort of old classic horror film style. And I think that just in some instances, not throughout the entire movie, certainly, but in some instances, the dramaticness, even though that's not the proper way to say it, but the way in which the scene was acted and portrayed was almost so dramatic that it became a little bit silly and sort of took away, at least for me, of the ambiance that was being built in the film for the majority of it. And for me, one thing that sort of stood out as why I wouldn't categorize this personally as a 4 or 5 star film is that I had heard, and I'll have to double check this for sure, so don't quote me on whether or not this is 100% correct, but I had heard that Robert Eggers wanted to be very true to what the lighting would be like in this particular sort of setting, and that he had lit it using only candlelight. And I have to say that that almost detracted for me from the film, even though it definitely, because of the way that it was done, like the way that they did, like the shadows were incredible, and the way that it was very simple then to have the light completely follow an actor and the background would just be utterly cast in black. And then you could sort of change scenes that way, I thought was incredibly unique and in a lot of ways very fascinating to see how that's done. And it works really, really perfectly for something like Nosferatu. However, if you are one of those people, for instance, who is complaining about how dark the second season of Silo is, good luck with Nosferatu. A lot of the scenes in this are so dark that it is kind of difficult to see what's going on in some of those elements. And I think for me, at least, occasionally, and certainly not in every scene, but occasionally it was difficult to see the actors' faces, see the emotion that's trying to be portrayed there. And that for me kind of takes a little bit of the actual horror out of it. I felt like Nosferatu at the end of the film came across as more strange and creepy than it did actual horror. There was no moment, let's say, during this film that I was really in a state of suspense or on the edge of my seat because of what was happening in the film. And part of that too, though I do understand that it is true to form, part of that really comes with some of the character creation for Count Orlok. He does have a mustache in this film, which is very prominent and does sort of, at least for me, and one other person at least that I chatted with at the film, the mustache did take away, though I think that it is meant to be sort of more accurate to kind of the area and certainly the time frame of when the movie is taking place. I do think I agree with this other person as well that it did sort of not match the creature in the film at the end of the day. But I don't know. I think it's really going to depend on what you think of the original and what types of movies you really enjoy watching. I think there maybe was a little bit of a time issue with this version of Nosferatu. I know the original 1922 version, I believe, is an hour and 20 minutes, 20, maybe 30 minutes. And this version is 2 hours and 15. And though there wasn't any particular scene that stood out to me as something that should have been cut out to shorten the time, I think that there definitely is, like I mentioned, a pacing issue there. And then add to that how dark the film is. For me, I did find myself a few times getting a little bit sleepy during the movie. And because to me, at least, Nosferatu, or this version of Nosferatu, wasn't really all that scary, it was harder to kind of keep in that suspenseful emotion for very long. And it was easy to kind of check out of what was going on in the movie because, again, it is just a copy of Bram Stoker, so it's not a story that I don't already know, or I am not aware of what's going to happen next or kind of where the story is going. And I've seen the original version of this. So I think that there are elements of this movie that are incredible. And then there are also elements of this film that I just wasn't the biggest fan of. So though I think it is good and worth the watch, I'm not sure if I can say that it's worth the watch in theater so much as, it would be worth the watch if it came on streaming. I think I was expecting sort of to be more frightened, if that makes sense. But that's a personal thing. It doesn't detract, I guess, away from the film as a whole. I do think that it was really great cinematography-wise and acting-wise, and the look of the film is really great. Just something was a little bit off there that didn't really keep me in the tension of the film throughout the entire thing, and that took away quite a bit for me in terms of overall likability. So those are really my thoughts on Nosferatu. I would love to know what you guys thought of this film if you have seen it. Subscribe to join the Movie Nerd family, and I hope to see you in the next episode.